Welcome to the Closed-Minded Podcast, where we read with an open mind in order to close it again on something solid. Folks, I've got a real treat for you today. My guest is George Gilder, a prolific author, economist, investor, and techno-futurist. In the 70s, Gilder wrote a controversial work about gender roles in society, originally titled Sexual Suicide, but it was later revised and reissued under the title Men and Marriage. In the 80s, as an articulator and defender of supply-side economics, he became known as President Ronald Reagan's most frequently quoted living author. In the early 90s, Gilder foresaw the broadband internet revolution, and he also predicted the development of the smartphone. There's even some evidence that he influenced Steve Jobs. Gilder hosts the annual Techo-Futurist conference with Steve Forbes, which draws tech leaders, inventors, entrepreneurs, and investors from around the world. He also co-founded the Discovery Institute, which is the leading think tank of the intelligent design movement. For over 30 years, Gilder has contributed to various publications, including Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, Wired, and National Review. The philosophical framework that unifies much of Gilder's thinking on science and technology is known as information theory, which he articulates and applies in his 2013 book, Knowledge and Power, The Information Theory of Capitalism and How It is Revolutionizing Our World. Some of his other books include Wealth and Poverty, Life After Television, Techo-Futurist, The Scandal of Money, and then most recently, Life After Google, The Fall of Big Data and the Rise of the Blockchain Economy. Our focus today is primarily life after Google. Gilder is an incredibly fascinating guy, and it was a lot of fun talking to him today. So here now is my interview with George Gilder. George Gilder, welcome to the Closed-Minded Podcast.
Delighted to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking about life after Google with you. You have written a handful of books across a variety of topics over the last 30 years. And this most recent one, I think, might be the most fascinating as far as I'm concerned. Maybe give us a brief overview, if you can, for being a pretty complex topic. What's the general thesis of Life After Google, and why did you write it?
Well, it struck me that Google had essentially a futile business strategy, a strategy based on giving away most of their goods and services for free in exchange for data about their customers, and then selling the data to advertisers. It's an aggregate and advertise model, and I didn't like it when it was used for television and when I wrote Life After Television, and now television is being transcended. And Google is adopting the same strategy that the old media used to use. And I think it's fundamentally a bad strategy.
So what are the hallmarks of that? What is it that makes it bad? I don't know if you want to talk about data centralization or the freemium approach.
It's just that prices are absolutely essential to the capitalist economy. Unless you have customers who are actually paying for your goods and services, you don't really have customers. And and without these fundamental customers, you don't have to provide security, because if you don't have real transactions going on, the burdens on security are greatly diminished. So you escape the burden of security. And the combination has created an internet that's a kind of porous pyramid where all the data and the money and power rises to the top. And where Google and Facebook and Amazon and a few big leviathans prevail. And I think this is fundamentally a breakdown of the internet dream that we all had at the beginning, which was a world wide web of glass and light and air that allowed everybody to interconnect around the world. the internet's now breaking into a set of conflicting fiefdoms and walled gardens, and it's no longer the peer-to-peer platform for commerce and ideas and creativity that it was created to be.
So let's talk about the way that, data centralization contributes to all of that. What specifically has Google done, or how do they operate in that space that risks our security and our privacy?
Well, Google's thesis, and the thesis of all the leviathans who dominate the internet, is that centralization is the safest process, that centralization is safe. But it turns out that centralization solves the biggest problem of hackers. Where's the data and what data is important? And so the result is that the more billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars is spent on security, the more personal data gets breached. And indeed, in 2018, 1 billion items were breached. First time to break the giga breach level. And that wasn't because they didn't spend more on security than ever. So fundamentally, the security model of the internet is hopelessly busted, broken, and it's got to be fixed. And it can't be fixed from the outside. It's got to be fixed with a new architecture. Security is not a patch or a team of anti-hackers. Security is an architecture, and the internet needs a new architecture.
Okay, I think that's a key point, is that that the internet needs a new architecture in order for us to be able to interact and transact without risking our data and our privacy and security. Because I think one of the things that might sound sort of confusing initially is, on one hand you say, well, there's no market incentive like a price indicator because, Google offers all of their products for free. I am really not the customer. I have no recourse if I have a problem with them. And so, there aren't price incentives and no market incentives in that sense to, motivate them to get better security. On the other hand, you just noted that the industry spends billions and billions of dollars on security, and yet, it doesn't seem to be doing much. We continue to see these massive data breaches and information that continues to be leaked. And
it's an all-time record last year. That was the worst ever.
Yeah. So
1 billion breaches.
Right. So, one of the things that I wrote in my review is sort of using an analogy of, we don't just need to, build a bigger wall around our data, our castle protecting our data, or, Google doesn't need to do that, or, whatever the financial institutions are that we're talking about. We need an entirely different architecture for maintaining and communicating with our data. It's something that actually will be secure, because, and I can't remember who it was, and it's probably apocryphal, but they asked some famous bank robber, why do you keep robbing banks? And he said, well, that's because that's where all the money is. So as long as, as you said, the big tech industries have done the biggest job of the hackers for them, they just keep these giant repositories of data. It doesn't matter how secure they are. It's always going to be overcome by new tech, new approaches, new ingenious methods of getting at the data. And instead, we need an entirely new architecture for managing all of that. And that's what you call the cryptocosm, correct?
Yeah, that's the development of blockchain and derivative technologies. It's not only blockchain, it's a whole series of innovations related to internet architecture.
Yeah. So I want to get into the specifics of the Cryptocosm in a minute, some of the practical elements of that. But before that, we've talked about the practical realities of Google's world and, all that entails. But I want to talk about the philosophy underlying what you call Google's system of the world, which I think you have a hat tip to Neil Stephenson and some of his novels related to that. Tell us about the fundamental flaw philosophically in how Google sees humanity and the world and, the supposed singularity that is coming. How does all of that contribute to this problem?
Well, I call it Google Marxism, and Google is making the same error that Marx made. Marx's chief error is fundamental misconception was that the industrial breakthroughs of the 19th century, the looms and steam engines and railroads and incipient electricity and all those great breakthroughs of the 19th century constituted a kind of final human achievement of wealth and productivity, that in the future we don't have to worry about producing wealth anymore. That'll be done by machines. And in the future, we just have to focus on redistributing wealth. And that was the basic Marxist error. And today, Google is making the same error. It says that it's in a even greater degree. It says that it's machine learning and artificial intelligence and biotech algorithms and search engines and big data. All are a kind of final human accomplishment, an eschaton. And in the future, people won't have to work anymore. We can dispose of most of the population with a guaranteed annual income, and Brennan Page and Elon Musk and whoever it is can enjoy a winner-take-all universe that emerges. But this is a fundamental error. The new robots are not any different from previous robots. They're just better, and they're improving at a rate that's about the same that they've improved ever since the Industrial Revolution. New technologies never destroy jobs if you allow them to be applied. New technologies make human beings more productive and thus more employable. People don't employ people because they're unproductive. The more productive they are, the more employable they are, the safer, better, more remunerative jobs they can perform. And so the whole idea of the singularity is fundamentally misconceived.
One of the things that you point out is that, and I think this aligns with what you just described about Google's fundamental error, is their idea that computers and algorithms can ever match human consciousness and the human creativity that comes from the human mind. And that's a fundamental flaw with understanding humanity. Would you agree with that?
Yes. I mean, since I wrote the book, I read a book by Michiko Kaku on the mind, and he said within it that in order to map the connectome of the human brain, that's all the connections of the various neurons in the human brain, all the axons and spindle cells and all the interconnections, synapses of the human brain, would take a zettabyte of information. That's 10 to the 22 of information, just a vast body of data. In that zettabyte, is about as much information as is commanded by the entire World Wide Web. All the storage on the whole World Wide Web comes to about a zettabyte, it's estimated. But the World Wide Web, the internet, and all its connected storage facilities consumes terawatts of energy. Well, that zettabyte of connections in the human brain consumes between 12 and 14 watts. In other words, the internet consumes billions of times more energy than the human brain. And it just is, they aren't even comparable. The idea that a computer has anything to do with how the brain functions is just nonsense. They can try to simulate brains on computers, but it has nothing to do with the way the human brain actually works. I have a cousin named Tony Stratton who spent his last 30 years at the University of Wisconsin studying the brain of a nematode worm, which is the smallest brain that's regarded to be a coherent mental function. And he says, at the beginning, I thought we would understand it in a couple years, and 30 years later, we hardly understand it any better. The connectome of the nematode worm is pretty baffling. Carver Mead, who's a great physicist and engineer from Caltech, says that nobody can really explain the energetics of how a fly avoids the swatter. There's no theory of a computation that can begin to explain the efficiency of the brain of a fly. We just don't understand how people think. And as a result, the idea that we understand that we can reproduce human consciousness on a computer is just quixotic, ridiculous.
So, and I agree with you, but it's just to play devil's advocate, don't you think some of the, maybe the Silicon Valley types who's on the opposite side of this issue would say, in terms of computational power and, utilization of heat or power, it's just a matter of time. They would just say, eventually we'll get to that point.
Well, they aren't. They aren't really making any progress. They don't understand the brain any better than they did before. Here the idea is, their concept is essentially the materialist superstition. They believe that if they knew the function and operation of every neuron or every molecule of the human brain, they would grasp how it functions. However, computer science tells us that that's a false belief. If you knew every molecule in the computer and how it connected to every other molecule, you still would have no idea of what the computer was doing unless you had access to the source code. That is the code that's supplied to the computer by human beings outside the computer. And it's the same way with the human mind. Knowing every molecule in the human mind and its location will not help you understand what the mind is doing or how it works.
Yeah, this might sound unrelated initially, but are you a fan of Lewis's Narnia Chronicles?
I like Lewis's Narnia Chronicles. I prefer his essay Transposition, which is directly relevant to this issue. Do you know Transposition?
I don't. I'm going to have to look it up.
it's really an essay in information theory, which is my basic science is information theory. I'm developing an information theory of economics and technology. And I've written Knowledge and Power and The Scandal of Money and
Yep, I've read both of those.
Life After Google are all works of information theory. And C.S. Lewis's essay Transposition has a crucial insight. And he begins by saying, imagine that you were trapped in a two-dimensional painting, and you had a complete theory of how a two-dimensional image works. You knew it all pigments and all frequencies and colors, and you knew the parallax computations and the angles, and you had it all worked out. And somebody came to you and said that, hey, your great landscape painting is just the barest reflection of a fantastic 3-4-dimensional world outside that is full of potential beyond your imagination. And the 2D thinker in that painting would say, I have no need for that hypothesis of more than 2 dimensions. 2 dimensions can completely explain my world. And I believe that the dominant Google philosophy bespeaks that same materialist superstition, that they essentially believe in a flat universe theory, that the whole universe can be explained by physics and chemistry. And when they do that, they deny the importance of their own technology, which is based on information theory. And as C.S. Lewis himself said, in order to understand a lower level, you have to understand the higher level from which it derives and which governs it. And if you don't understand the higher level, you can't understand the lower level. And that is, he put it more eloquently than I have here. I've forgotten the exact quote, but that's the essence of transposition. And it's the essence of Life After Google as well, that you can't, the singularity is based on the materialist superstition, that information really is just an emergent phenomenon. It just derives from material relationships, that it's and that is the materialist superstition. It's just false, and it's rendered false by the very computer science on which all the wealth of Silicon Valley is founded.
Yeah, that's the irony, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of, the reasoning about, there's a particular reason why science rose in the West, in the Christian West, because it requires a philosophical understanding and of, a rational universe and a rational creator and laws that you can rely upon, and instead of the whims of the gods. And, you have to have a framework that's outside of science in order to even do science. And I feel like that's a similar vein. The reason I brought up Lewis, and it's funny, Lewis tends to make his points in prose, in nonfiction prose, and then enflesh them in his fiction. But the reason I thought of Narnia is in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. There's a scene where they interact with a retired star, and one of the characters asks, he says, well, in my world, a star is just a fiery ball of gas. And he corrects this kid, and he says, well, that's what a star is made of, but that's not what a star is.
That's a good distinction. I mean, Lewis is full of wisdom of this kind.
All right, so I think we've done a pretty good job covering some of the philosophical errors that are underlying Google's approach to the world, understanding humanity. Let's talk about the cryptocosm. So, give me some specifics of what the blockchain and brings to data decentralization. How does data decentralization promise to deliver us from Google's system of the world? What does that mean?
Well, when you go on the net today, you have to justify yourself to each of all your various connections on the web, all the various sites that you want to visit. You have to prove your identity, a separate username and password for each one. Hundreds, thousands of potential username and password combinations and combinatorial explosions. So the current web is based on the user qualifying for all his transactions on the web. He has to prove himself to each one. The Cryptocosm, the blockchain, allows each user to have an unimpeachable identity, like his reflecting his DNA in a private key, and all the various transactors on the internet have to respect that private key and its associated public key whenever they deal with the user. So the Cryptocosm kind of inverts the whole present internet. The current internet is top down, ruled by a few big leviathans, and the users all have to adapt to them. The new internet, the user is king, and all the various internet players have to defer to the user, have to respect the user's identification as content, as data. And that's the difference. It's a completely different architecture for the internet.
Wow. So let's talk about some of the practical realities that are possible with blockchain. I've heard, seen it being used for, registering land titles, facilitating, real estate transactions, any sort of contractual business deal that can be, locked into, the blockchain, or sort of the digital amber of time. Do you have any other examples of that?
Well, it allows you to have verified facts on the internet. It allows you to have a foundation of truth on the internet, attestation. And I think it's most important. It's often said that the internet money, cryptocurrencies allow you to be anonymous. And yes, they sort of allow you to be anonymous, but ultimately, if the police or something want to track you down across the internet, the various cryptocurrencies won't protect you. And the key thing the cryptocurrencies do is allow attestation. You can prove what you actually did. If the tax man comes, you can prove all your transactions unimpeachably in a way that can't be changed, so that it gives you the ability of attestation. In the existing internet, anything can be changed. The internet is a vast copying machine, and any facts on the internet are infinitely changeable. And what the blockchain does is create a set of facts related to identity and access and personal data that can't be changed. And that allows the user to prove that is not guilty of some offense, or prove as part of a business contract that they actually complied with the rules or the promises. It makes for an internet economy that actually functions in a provable and reliable way.
So one of the more interesting, I think, implementations of this is the Brave browser. What can you tell me about that?
Well, Brendan Eich is one of the giants of the history of the internet. He helped create the Netscape browser. He brought secure sockets layer to the Netscape browser, which was the first browser on the internet. And he then, when Microsoft essentially copied the Netscape browser by buying Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina's copy from Mosaic at the University of Indiana, where they came from, so that Netscape had to compete with their earlier invention. Ike, who had also invented JavaScript that made Netscape work, and which is now the world's most popular computer language, is JavaScript, invented by Brendan Eich. Brendan Eich went and created Mozilla and Firefox and created the prevailing new browser. And now, with the general breakdown of security on the internet and the general resistance to the manipulation of data by the big giant players on the internet, Brendan Eich has launched a new browser called the Brave browser, and it blocks advertising and cookies and other ways that the big companies can manipulate you, the big leviathans. And he thus again gives the owner of the data, the owner of the content, the possessor of the identification, control over it. And so the user once again has control. And he also allows micropayments for advertisers. So if an advertiser wants you to look at their ad, they got to pay you a micropayment, and the micropayments accumulate, and you can use the micropayments to pay for content on the internet that's otherwise published freely. And so it really creates a new economy on the internet that will function much more smoothly than the existing one does, because identities aren't such complex. You don't have hundreds of usernames and passwords and security questions and combinatorial confusion. Instead, you got one identity, and everybody has to come to you and respect and recognize that identity, as they do in the real world.
So let's talk about cryptocurrencies in general and Bitcoin in particular. We've got a whole lot of competing coins and tokens out there performing a variety of different functions. Do you anticipate, in terms of a currency that's widely used, is Bitcoin going to come out on top, or do you think we're going to see something else rise? Are we just going to have to live with having lots and lots of competing currencies that at some point we're able to just translate between rapidly?
Well, we've got a long history about currencies. And just as the Cryptocosm addresses this crucial problem of internet security, which reached a peak in 2018 with 1 billion breached data points, the cryptocurrencies are also address the problem of money. And they allow attestation so you can prove what you did. But they also allow money to be global and real rather than national and manipulable by central banks. And so what cryptocurrencies permit is to return to the kind of world that existed until around 1971, when we left the gold standard. Throughout most of history, money was gold. Ever since Isaac Newton really established the gold standard in England in the early 18th century, gold has been the foundation of money. And thus you had a global money. Money was a measuring stick, ultimately rooted in an unchangeable element with 79 protons. And the cryptocurrencies that model themselves on gold and successfully can be real money. And then all their digital capabilities can add to their fundamental functionality as money, a measuring stick. Money is a measuring stick, not a magic wand for central banks and governments. It's a measuring stick of value. And that was true when it was gold. And it will be true in the new digital era with new forms of gold emerging. Now, Satoshi thought he was mimicking gold with Bitcoin. But he made a great mistake. He spent too much time around the universities, and he imagined that gold was running out, that like all physical resources, it was running out. And this is what the materialist superstition suggests to people, that somehow the planet is being depleted by human industry. And the fact is, gold for hundreds of years, thousands of years, has been increasing in volume by a factor of about 2% a year. And they're now planning to extract gold from the oceans, from slag heaps, from meteors. Elon Musk talks about extracting gold from the moon. There's gold is not running out at all. And so Satoshi's decision to cap Bitcoin at 21 million units was a mistake, 21 million Bitcoins. And it means that there are fewer and fewer, in 200 years or less, 2140 or something, the last Bitcoin will be minted. But almost all of them have already been minted. And there's a lot of attrition already, a lot of lost Bitcoins. So Bitcoin needs to have a mode of expansion that resembles the process of mining gold.
So why does it need to expand? I mean, I understand that if it's trying to mimic gold, then that's one thing in which it's, Bitcoin is different. But I guess what's the problem with having a finite supply of Bitcoin? Wouldn't prices just continue to, match the final pool of money that Bitcoin represents and adjust accordingly?
It could. It could happen, but it makes it. Right today, we see Bitcoin being bought by speculators massively, in the expectation that it's inexorably scarce, and thus its price is going to soar some immense degree in future years. And it just makes Bitcoin much less like real money. It makes Bitcoin volatile in a way that real valid money as a measuring stick can't be volatile. You can't float a measuring stick. The second, the meter, the kilogram, the mole, the lumen, the ampere, all the measuring sticks that underlie global trade are all tied to physical constants and are immutable. And Bitcoin is on a track that renders it deflationary, artificially deflationary. Not deflationary in the sense that innovation and information technology is deflationary, but artificially deflationary as a currency. And I think that means that Bitcoin will probably be replaced by some currency that more closely resembles gold.
So something else will probably rise up that does have some sort of built-in inflationary measure to the supply?
Yeah, and I think it's not an inflationary measure. It's just a principle of expansion that corresponds to some degree to the likely growth of economic activity and for money around the world. And that's my prediction. Now, it's going to be a real intense competition. What is the digital money that finally succeeds when the existing fiat currency catastrophe plays out? I mean, it's this whole idea that money is an instrument of sovereignty to be manipulated by central banks in order to promote trade or stimulate demand, or all the various chimeras that are currently entertained about money are just wrong. And now all central banks of the world imagine that they can just print money and debt to an unlimited degree. We now have $250 trillion of debt. And we have $5.1 trillion a day of currency trading. That's 25 times all world GDP, 70 times or something, all world trade in goods and services. And yet it doesn't even arrive at currency values that relieve businesses of the need to constantly hedge every international transaction they pursue. So we have a huge hedging business, and it all ends up with a threat to the global economy that we face today. And when that threat comes to pass, when we have another kind of crash like 2008, the world is going to look for a digital money, it strikes me, and that this digital money is going to be supplied. And it may be Bitcoin, a new fork of Bitcoin that allows it to expand more readily. There are various ways that it could be some form of Bitcoin, but I don't believe it's going to be the current 21 million unit capped Bitcoin, even though they have 100 million possible granularity of the, Satoshis, or 100 millionth of a Bitcoin, and as they're called. And so it's not a matter of, of not having enough units. It's a matter of the basic valuation of the Bitcoin itself and its volatility in a world where there's attrition of Bitcoins get lost, Bitcoins get stolen, Bitcoins get, only 21 million will ever be created. If Bitcoin grew like gold grows, it would be 316 million Bitcoins by 2041.
Wow. Well, so as we wrap up here, I just kind of want to ask you a few just miscellaneous rapid fire questions. I assume that you own Bitcoin, or at least some degree of cryptocurrency. Have you done or do you regularly engage in just crypto transactions to buy and sell things?
Well, I've got two companies that have had initial coin offerings. ICO, which is the great breakthrough that Ethereum accomplished over the last couple years, in responding to the crash of IPOs, initial public offerings, which used to be the usual way that companies gained liquidity. IPOs have dropped 90% in the last 20 years. And this has been a real crisis in venture capital. The usual liquidity events don't happen. And so we've moved from a world where there were 7 initial public offerings for every merger and acquisition to a world where there are 22 merger and acquisitions roughly for every IPO, so that the amount of equity out there has shrunk more than 50% in the American stock exchanges, and it's been a crisis. And Ethereum has raised $20 billion, more than $20 billion over the last couple of years in ICOs, initial coin offerings. And they have financed a whole bunch of crypto companies, including Rivets, which is a security company that I've invested in, helped start, and also Otoy, which is another company I helped start, and which I describe in some detail in Life After Google. And I've given Bitcoins away for graduation presents. I believe in giving them to people for graduation presents. It gives them a real understanding of how it works, and that's been successful. I don't think Bitcoin is especially convenient for transactions at the moment. It is a somewhat cumbersome process. It's useful for big international transactions and transfers. And I wish I'd had it when I did my Chinese version of Life After Google, which was number 2 in China for a while, and was recently number 4 in China. But it's very hard to get money from China. And so I really understand the need for international currency that's global, that's not affected by the endless float, $5.1 trillion a day, and all the fees and frictions and tolls and confusions that surround international monetary transfers today.
Are you familiar with the startup Abra, which is trying to solve sort of the last mile?
Yep, Abra. I wrote about Abra in Life After Google, and Abra still has a way to go before it actually becomes a prevalent way of handling remittances in the international economy, relatively small transfers. They're trying to do it, and they've done it to some degree, and they've got a plan, but it hasn't quite happened yet, as far as I know.
Yeah, I signed up as a teller just out of interest, just to kind of see what it was like to go through the process. And I did at least one transaction from a guy who also was just doing it to see how it worked. He was a CPA somewhere. He drove like 40 miles to meet me just to do a transaction.
Oh, yeah.
That was kind of fun.
Yeah, that sounds great. I shouldn't talk about Abra because I haven't checked it out for a few months, but quite recently it was changing its business plan, is all I can tell you.
How has your thesis been received within Silicon Valley? Like, are you in contact with any of the people that you're basically preaching against and undermining their worldview? Do you get responses?
You know, I have gotten very little response. I've gotten lots of sales in Silicon Valley, but not many responses. I've gotten lots of people who like the book, but the actual leaders in Silicon Valley, most of them, have not responded. Ray Kurzweil is one of my favorite people. He lives near me, and I think he's a tremendous mind, and I quote him a lot in Life After Google. Life After Google probably wouldn't have happened without Ray, but I don't think he solved the problem of mind. He's written a book called How to Make a Mind, and I don't think it actually explains the mind. So I'd be interested to know what he thinks. But anyway, I have Larry Page has not responded. Schmidt, was one of his I've worked with throughout. Helped him launch the Java language when he was at Sun Microsystems. Who was chairman of Google. I think he may still be chairman of Alphabet. But anyway, Eric Schmidt hasn't responded, but I can wait. We're having a whole bunch of conferences and debates and stuff in Silicon Valley. So I expect as time passes, we're going to be able to get more response.
So when it comes to Google, I guess, how is it they can adapt? Do you think they will adapt? What would that look like? Do they even realize the threat that their worldview poses to, reality? I
think so, because their big competition is Chinese companies like Tencent, Baidu, Alibaba, a whole bunch of them. And all those companies have learned how to collect money from their customers. ByteDance, Flytek, a whole bunch of companies in China do not use the advertising model that Google and Facebook employ. In other words, the Chinese companies tend to collect about 10% of their income from advertising, while Google and Facebook collect 95% from advertising. And I think this is a real danger. The real danger to Google is the Chinese technologies that are emerging. And I think they understand that, I believe, by now. They're beginning to try to mimic some of their Chinese competitors. So I think they understand their predicament. It's just hard to change in midstream. I think that one of the reasons for all the suspicion between China and the United States is that the existing internet on which we all rely is hopelessly insecure. So we're always hacking one another. The NSA is hacking China, and China's hacking us, and nobody trusts anybody. And I think that the blockchain can offer a new path to trust and will relieve a lot of the pressures on and suspicions and paranoia toward Huawei, for instance. Huawei's a great company, probably the greatest telecom equipment entrepreneurial story in the world in the last 25 years. It really doesn't have much competition in that role. It's a private company. It's an effect of imitating American companies, and we want to stop it because we think we have this sort of chimerical view that a telecom equipment company can install little surveillance devices and backdoors in all its chips and subvert the American economy. It's really ridiculous. If we can't test out our equipment, if Huawei did that, they wouldn't have any customers. No one would want to buy their equipment. It's just sort of an absurdity. So what we're really doing is just trade war. We're trying to block a great supplier of 5G technology from the American economy, and that means that the Chinese will have better 5G and better communications than we do. Now, all the fear about surveillance and all, I think, is exaggerated. All of us are under surveillance all the time, through Google and all the companies that pour through all our data, and on the other hand, big cities are vulnerable like never before to terrorism. As biotech and nuclear weapons and other devices become more portable and more accessible to people, security in cities becomes increasingly vital. And I think the Chinese are addressing that problem. And the idea that governments care about every detail about you is not as true as that Google cares about every detail about you, because it wants to sell these details to its advertising customers. In general, it's up to us to protect ourselves from subversion, and that's the challenge that we have. And we can't blame the Chinese if we can't even tell whether telecom gear is spying on us. That's just reflects ignorance of how telecom gear works and how it can be sold and how it can be tested. It's just an ignorant protectionist stance by the American government. And it's too bad that we're doing it, because Huawei is one of the great success stories of the American opening to China.
So do you think that even if the surveillance through the hardware concept is overblown, to the extent that it exists at all, is it because of the centralized data model? And with the blockchain approach, with everything relying on solid encryption and decentralization, that wouldn't really even matter if there were backdoors?
My argument is that just as the trade war is really a money war, it's an effect of all these wildly floating currencies that gyrate up and down all the time. That's why we have trade conflicts. And I believe that the reason we have these protectionist suspicions against foreign technology companies is the porous pyramid of the internet, where all the data and money power rises to the top. And customers don't even control their own content and identity. And I think when customers control their own identities and content, it will improve the security of the internet. Now, we also do need to scrutinize our telecom equipment. That's why you have telecom companies. But to banish all the suppliers from China is just deeply destructive to the world economy. China manufactures most of our technology, China and Taiwan. It's vital to the U.S. economy. We recently had a 40% drop in exports because of our trade war against China. It's just preposterous. It's not China's fault that we aren't manufacturing stuff. It's the fault of the green movement, of global warming paranoia. That's what really brought our manufacturing capabilities to a halt. We're doing it to ourselves and then blaming China. It's really absurd.
Is there a spot on the internet that I can refer people if they want to find your work or your articles or your books, anything like that?
Well, I have two Facebook pages. One is called the Techo-Futurist Forum, and one is called the Israel Test. And there's www.gildertech.com, which is Forbes' paid forum that I run. And during the next year, I'm going to be doing a whole series of newsletters and other publications under new management. So there's going to be a lot more to talk about in the future.
This was great. Thanks so much. One thing I didn't get to really talk to you about, because it was sort of outside the scope of this, was your work with the Discovery Institute. And I really like the way that all of your ideas, whether it's through Scandal of Money or Life After Google or information or Knowledge and Power, I see all of those ideas cropping up in the Discovery Institute content as well. And I just really like the way that everything that you say shows up in all aspects of your thought. Like I can just see all of those ideas flourishing in so many different topics and genres of thought. It's really fun to see.
Well, thank you so much. That takes real insight to see those connections.
Well, George Gilder, I really appreciate your tech optimism throughout Life After Google. Extremely stimulating read, extremely stimulating conversation. Thank you so much for participating in the show and contributing your talents and your mind. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Seth. I really appreciate your questions.
And that wraps up episode 8. I hope you enjoyed that discussion as much as I did. Gilder is eminently fascinating to me, and I particularly enjoy the ways that I can see his understanding of information theory break into all of his thinking on everything from intelligent design to Google's approach to managing our data. Before I reached out to George about doing an interview, I posted a written book review of Life After Google over on the podcast site. He told me he'd read it and that he enjoyed it, so that was pretty cool. I'll link to the review on the show notes page at closemindedpodcast.com/8, and I'll also provide links to Gilder's other books, his Facebook pages for the Telecosm Forum and the Israel Test, and also his website, gildertech.com. Look, people, if books and interviews like this don't classify for you as reading widely and with an open mind, I got nothing else for you. See you next time.
I wish upon you true, and all you feel is doubt. I hope you know that an open mind still knows when to shut things out. I wish upon you a brave heart that will always rise above. But most of all, I